He introduced me like an ornament. The chandeliers spilled like milk over the marble floor. Women in silk leaned like flowers against cold pillars. Men moved through the light with practiced ease, their cufflinks flickering. Fletcher stood beside me as if I were his coat, one hand on my back, the other smoothing his tie. He had the smile of a man who owned the room and everyone in it. I had practiced smiling that smile, the one that did not ask questions, the one that said thank you and know your place. "Everyone, this is," he said, loud enough for the circle around him to turn, "the help." It landed in the room like ice. There were polite chuckles, the quick tilt of heads, the soft clink of glasses. Some people looked away, uncomfortable. Others leaned in, savouring the social cruelty like a morsel. I felt my name fall out of my mouth and onto the floor in pieces. Julian Blackwood was across the room, as handsome and impossible as a memory. He had the kind of face you might forgive for being cruel, clear eyes, an unpremeditated ease. He had been introduced as the new CEO earlier in the night. He moved differently from the rest of them, as if he didn't have to perform. He stopped when he saw me, and everything else, for a heartbeat, narrowed to the space between us. The music dimmed. He looked at me like he knew the contours of my jawline by heart. "Julian," I heard myself say, though my voice was a foreign thing. Fletcher's hand tightened at the base of my throat in that way that was somehow both a warning and a claim. Julian blinked once, and then there was a small intake of breath that felt like a recognition, one of those old familiar things, a name arriving on the back of a wind you thought gone forever. He moved toward us as if the wave had pulled him. For a second, everything else blurred. Guests became bodies, like theatre props. The sound of the orchestra washed into static. "You," he said, not loud, but perfectly clear, as if the room allowed him to speak. He wasn't speaking to me at first. He was speaking to something in the air between us. "I've been looking for you for 30 years. The sentence settled like an accusation against the life that had been arranged for me. Fletcher's smile froze in that brittle way it did when he thought his plan might bend. He put a hand on my arm that felt suddenly foreign. "Moren," he said, with a veneer of civility that could have been used to polish knives. "This is my wife." Fletcher's voice was meant to re-establish order. Instead, it sounded thin. Julian reached for my gloved hand and did the thing people do when they remember they are still human. He held it with gentle authority, like he was confirming I existed. Up close, the light caught a small emerald on my finger, an heirloom that glittered like a promise I had once believed in. It lay warm against his palm. For a second, I could have been 22 again. "You're," he began, and I saw the recognition settle fully in his face. "Moren." It could have been a scene from another life, another currency of guilt and longing. Instead, Fletcher spoke first. He smiled like a man repairing a hairline crack in marble. "I'm sorry to interrupt. We were just—" He stopped, and then, to the room, to whoever he thought he needed to impress, he said it again, an easy cruelty that had been polished over many years. "This is our help. She manages things at home." A laugh, thin and brittle, made its way around the circle. I remember the sharpness of the air in that moment, how the chatter picked up like a tide. The world turned to people observing a tableau. I felt my insides fold into the shape I'd been trained to be, small, unseen, useful only as background. Julian's face didn't reflect the room. It reflected something older, more private and haunted. I watched him, and in the corner of my vision, I saw Fletcher's hand move, tight and certain. He did not miss the way Julian looked at us. He never did. Everything Fletcher did was strategy. He sought advantage as a man might seek shelter. He dropped a business card into my gloved hand as if it were a stone. The card was white, edged in black, with Julian's name embossed on it, clean, decisive. The drop felt like a verdict and a lifeline at once. After a moment so dense it could be cut, Julian stepped back. The orchestra swelled. People returned to their places. Fletcher guided me through a small doorway away from the lights, away from other people's eyes. He kept talking about small things, donations, mutual acquaintances, the new building they were opening next month. I held the card until my fingers went numb. If this moment is reaching you, if it's making your chest tighten like it did mine, tell me where you're watching from. Comment the city you're in. It keeps me feeling less alone in the world that suddenly tilts. The ride home smelled like cologne and plastic flowers. Fletcher talked the whole way about press, about contacts, about the optics of the evening. I listened, like I had been taught to do, compartmentalizing, priorities, smiles, the exact length of a pause that signalled consent. My hand found the ring in my coat pocket, an emerald set in white gold, deep as something living. I remembered the way it had felt when I first slid it onto my finger, heavy with the promise of security. Security was the language Fletcher spoke best. He had been careful and precise with his love, contractual, tidy. He wrote checks that said he would take care of me. He moved money into accounts I wasn't allowed to touch. He handed me a monthly allowance accompanied by a ledger and a look that asked me to be grateful. He knew how to make gratitude feel like a litmus test. Later, after the door clicked behind us, and the house hummed with the safe, antiseptic air of things kept in order, I lay awake with the card on my bedside table and the emerald pulling at the light. I tried to remember the exact shape of Julian's voice when he had said my name. He had never said my name like that in public before. Not once. In his voice it sounded like history and like apology, like someone acknowledging a debt they couldn't reconcile alone. The memory of it fitted neatly into a decade of other memories. Laughter in cramped dorm rooms, the reckless way we believed in each other, a bus ticket pressed into my hand because he couldn't afford the fare home. Flashbacks came without warning like old photographs. College had been its own kind of freedom. We had read the same books and stolen the same lunches. He had taught me to dance in a parking lot under a flaring sodium light, and I had braided his hair like it was a child's. He was the kind of person who loved with all the gods of small things, books, late-night coffee, the slow architecture of a conversation. I loved him in the messy, reckless way that makes you brave enough to keep your heart out in the open. When I discovered I was pregnant, we were 22 and certain that the future could be bent to our will. We told no one at first. We wanted to shape that tiny certainty into something that could survive scrutiny. There was a plan in our heads. Love, a small house, a child who would grow in a place warmed by two people who had built their promises together. Julian's father, Charles Blackwood, had other plans. He was a man whose kindness arrived wrapped in the language of strategy, philanthropic gestures, public endorsements, a smile that displayed teeth like a ledger. He loved his son the way a gardener might love a plant that could be sold. When he found out about the pregnancy, he did not say how wonderful. He said, "There are windows you do not understand yet. You should not put your life in front of a window you cannot see beyond." It wasn't an argument so much as an arithmetic. Charles told Julian he had to make choices. There were reputations to protect, boards to appease, futures to secure. The pressure was a tangible thing, not a shout, but a series of sentences designed to reduce the possibility of mess. He presented options as inevitabilities. He told Julian of alliances he might lose, of donations that could be revoked, of markets that might close. He painted me as the risk. Julian listened like someone being taught how to sink slowly into water. He loved me. He also loved a version of his life that included his father's name and the inherited weight of the company. The ultimatum took shape in hushed conversations, in the quiet where love surrendered to pragmatism. "Please," I said once when I understood the edges of the choice he was being made to take, "don't let them make you choose me over yourself." "That's not what this is," he said, but his voice had the hesitancy of someone whose rope had begun to fray. Eventually, the conversation dissolved into 100 little compromises. I told myself we would get through it. We promised that the child, should we be blessed with one, would be our reason to sew the frayed ends back together. 3 weeks later, I miscarried. The hospital smelled like anesthesia and lemon disinfectant. There was a small clinical room and the soft murmur of nurses moving through rote gestures. I remember the way Julian's hands shook when he held mine, 2 fingers pressing into my palm, as if to anchor us both to the air. I remember his father's tight jaw, the information that did not need to be voiced, all of it folding under the weight of what had been lost. It changed everything. Not because it should have, but because it did. Because grief is a loud thing, and because some losses require you to make decisions you would otherwise never choose. It was in that small aftermath of pain and the exhaustion of trying to be brave that Fletcher found his opportunity. Fletcher was not sudden. He was patient the way winter is patient. He was also deliberate. He arrived like a rescue ship in a storm, with promises wrapped in the appearance of salvation. He told me he could take care of me. He spoke in concrete terms about security and houses, and the relief of not having to worry about day-to-day survival. He offered a future that smelled of polished wood and financial statements. There was a logic to his proposal that felt for a while like logic itself. At 24, raw and wearied by grief, security was persuasive. I'd been taught to believe that stability was a kind of love, predictable meals, bills paid, the absence of hunger. He offered that and more. An apartment in a building with a doorman, a ring that glittered with an emerald like the one Julian had once pressed into my hand, a public legitimacy that made certain things quieter. I married him because it was easier to believe in safety than to endure the uncertainty of rebuilding alone. I told myself I was making an adult choice. I told myself the child we had lost had asked for me to be brave in new ways. I told myself what everyone tells themselves when stepping into a life of compromise: I will be fine. It will be fine. And for a time, the new life was all I could ask of it. There were dinners where Fletcher praised my ability to host, to make the house feel like a postcard. He taught me, with a soft ferocity, the etiquette that would make me acceptable at the right tables. He opened doors to social circles I had never imagined myself in. He bought clothes that fit the new role, taught me to smile in the way the mirror liked. But there is a difference between being welcomed into a room and being allowed to exist within it. Fletcher's affection came with a contract, to be seen, but only on his terms. He reminded me how fortunate I was to be married into his life. When I asked questions, about finances, about autonomy, he had an answer that sounded considerate and shut me down with an ease that made me think I was the one being unreasonable. "Don't embarrass me," he would say when I spoke too freely. It was a small command, but it contained a world. He structured our lives so that I had to ask permission for things most people treated as natural. He called a courtesy a favour and treated the favour as evidence of my indebtedness. It was slow, like the way mould grows in a house that is never aired. There were other things, more discreet: a hand on my arm that left a shadow one morning, a bruise on the inside of my elbow that I wrapped with scarves and long sleeves when guests came over. He called those moments accidents or clumsy jokes. When I protested, he had a manner of being contrite that felt like an apology, but never changed the behaviour. I learned to speak in half-truths and white lies to keep the peace, to keep the world looking as he wanted it to look. He introduced me at social events in ways that made me small. "She keeps the household running," he would say, as if my purpose could be summed up in domesticity alone. I became an accessory to a carefully curated image. Over the years, the comments accumulated like frost. He would tell friends in private that I needed to stay in the back when we attended functions, a phrase said half-jokingly among men who wore power like armour. It felt like a leash. There were moments of tenderness, genuinely given. He could be absurdly generous at times, and I learned how to be grateful for kindnesses that came with strings. I kept the emerald because it was a tether to something I had once decided, and because throwing it away felt like a public declaration I was not ready to make. When I looked at it, sometimes I could still picture Julian's hand closing around mine, the warmth of an old promise. Mostly, I kept it because it was mine, and it was the one defiant thing I would not relinquish entirely, years folded into themselves. I learned how to blend courage into invisible pockets. I became a woman who could perform gratitude and maintain silence. I learned to measure my appetite for freedom in small, careful increments. There were nights, though, rare, shameful, that I would stand by the window and watch the rain over the city and remember a time when life had been less certain, but more honest. I thought about Julian's laugh in the common room of that shabby apartment, about the way he read aloud to me, about the way he had said my name like an answer. I wondered what he had been taught to accept by his father, what he had been required to give up in the name of legacy. The business card on my bedside table kept twitching at the corners of my attention. It was an object that insisted on being more than paper. For the first time in a long time, an option had been dropped into my life that did not come with an invoice attached. It slipped into my palm with a small, decisive weight. Julian Blackwood, the Blue Moon Cafe, Tuesday noon. I imagined the cafe, soft light, coffee that smelled like almonds, a bell over the door that chimed like possibility. It was a place of low wood and honest steam, the sort of place where conversations began without the vigilance of a gala. The image felt like breath. Yet the life I had learned to inhabit had safeguards that were difficult to unlearn. The ledger, the accounts I did not touch, the voice in the night that reminded me of the price of independence. I knew what curiosity could cost in the calculus Fletcher kept. Questions could be framed as acts of disloyalty. An unguarded step could trigger a retraction of comfort. He could make abundance evaporate in ways that were administrative and therefore devastating. Still there was the card, bright and expectant on the lacquered nightstand. It felt like someone had opened a window in a house that had been sealed for years. I turned it over in my hand. His name, a number, a time. The ink was steady, the print uncompromising. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I laid with the ring warm against my chest and the card on the mattress beside it. I thought of all the small betrayals that had accumulated to form the life I wore like a dress. I thought of how easily one word, the help, could lob a missile at someone's self-worth. In the morning, Fletcher was the Fletcher who made coffee and read the paper with a brow that softened only when he chose to soften it. He did not know, could never know, the conversation that had happened in the ballroom 3 hours before. He had no idea that a man who once held my hand in the dark had stepped into a room and found me in a life he had not been permitted to inhabit. "Busy day," he said as he kissed the top of my head. It was an efficient affection, like a signature. "Yes," I answered. My voice felt measured and clean. I left the card where it was and told myself to be practical. Time, I thought, demanded a plan. There are moments when your choice is more than a private rebellion. It becomes the axis by which your life will pivot. Standing at the small sink in the bathroom, water warming my hands, I realized how tired I was of living in polite margins. I was tired of defining myself by what others had decided I should be. I was tired of shrinking. For the first time in a long while, I acted before the fear could paralyze me. I took the card from the nightstand and slid it into the pocket of my coat. It felt both ridiculous and momentous. I imagined, absurdly, tossing the emerald into the river, but the thought stopped short. Some things are anchors, some are reminders of what we survived. I called in sick to the office that day, an allowance Fletcher made with the kind of prepared bafflement that made you feel like you were asking for a favour. He said it was fine, that rest was important. He told me to not make waves, as if making waves was the only thing a person could possibly do wrong. The world with Fletcher was careful and calming in the particular way of a life arranged not to surprise you. On my way to meet Julian, because I had decided in the quieter terror of my own stomach to go, I stopped outside the small florist near the station. I bought a single stem of something pale and wild, a gesture to myself more than to anyone else. The petal was soft under my thumb, a contrast to the hardness my life had been tempered with. At the cafe, I smoothed my coat and told myself again that I would be careful. I would not make promises I could not keep. I would not be the kind of woman who ran into the arms of an old lover and expected an easy salvation. I had lived too long in compromise to believe in fairy tales. What I wanted, quietly and fiercely, was a chance to be counted as myself. When I pushed through the door, the bell sounded like a punctuation mark, not too loud, not too bright. The room smelled like coffee and a hint of lemon. Someone at a corner table was reading the paper. There was a low hum of conversation, a place where secrets did not immediately find a way to be weapons. He was there, unfussy, a little paler than I recalled, but with the same set to his mouth. He stood as I came in, and the years seemed to compress into that small movement. He did not reach out immediately. Instead, he looked at me with a softness that made my skin feel like it had been washed. "Moren," he said, and in his voice there was the same old constancy. "Thank you for coming." I slid into the seat opposite him, the card tucked somewhere between the folds of my bag, the emerald heavy against my palm through the fabric of my coat. We sat like two people who had navigated tides to find themselves, each nursing an interior map of what had been lost and what might still be. "You look like you haven't slept," he observed after a moment. He was not trying to be kind, he was trying to be truthful. "I haven't," I admitted. "I have a husband who plans my calendar." He frowned, not with judgment, but with the confusion of a man who had once believed the world could be bent by love. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were simple and exact. "I didn't come here for pity." My voice surprised me with its steadiness. "I came here because you put that card in my hand last night at the gala." He nodded. "I know. I didn't mean to—" He searched for a word. "I didn't mean to complicate things." "Complicated a life that was already complicated?" I asked, because I wanted to know where truth would fall between us. He shifted in his chair, and then, with a small, decisive movement, he reached into his jacket and unfolded a small cloth envelope. From it, he took out papers, neat, typed, and unambiguous. They were not large. In fact, they were more of a symbol than anything. Contracts, he told me, that could be an offer of employment. Blackwood Industries had openings in a branch he managed. It wasn't a rescue. It was a professional opportunity, and he made sure to say it aloud. "I am offering you a job, Morin, if you want it." The word want pulled at a place I had been taught to ignore. Want, in my life, had been clipped to fit the boundaries Fletcher assigned. To say I wanted anything without accounting to him felt like an act of impropriety. "I don't know if I can," I said. "I mean, it's not that I don't believe you, but I'm married." "You're married," he echoed gently. "I'm not asking you to break anything. I'm asking you to be yourself in the world." He leaned forward, the way people lean when they are not trying to persuade you, but to show you the map of possibilities. "I have the resources to support you through something like this," he said. "Not to buy you freedom, no one can be bought, but to give you the means to choose. You deserve that." He did not speak of undoing my marriage. He did not speak in absolutes. He spoke of employment, of a salary, of access to accounts I could control. He gave me agency on a tray and left the rest to me. For the first time in years, I felt a crack of heat. Hope. It was frightening because hope is an incendiary thing in a life built on controlled fires. I imagined my name on a business card with my own title. I imagined walking into a room and not being announced as anything but myself. But there were practicalities I could not ignore. Fletcher controlled the finances. He managed our accounts and had access to the lines of credit. He could, if he chose, make the life I was trying to build impossible to maintain. He loved the power of proving his point. He had always been a man who saw leverage as a moral quality. "I'll think about it," I said, not wanting to commit in a moment of emotion. It felt dishonest. He nodded, as if he expected me to be cautious. "You don't have to decide today," he said, "but I will make an appointment for you to meet with Rebecca, my assistant, if you want. She'll walk you through the role." Rebecca's name was familiar in a way that felt like an old thread found in a pocket. She would be the bridge, Julian explained. She would show me the parameters and the realities of the job. It was practical, and therefore oddly comforting. Outside, the city moved with the indifferent rhythm of a place that doesn't care about the private arrangements of hearts. Inside the cafe, time kept its own honest pace. I left with a small slip of paper folded in my palm. Julian's secretary had scribbled a time and place for an interview, and beneath it, in a careful hand that didn't reveal everything, a number. The emerald weighed heavy in the pocket of my coat, and for the first time in a long time I felt the place I had been trained to keep empty begin to fill. I had not promised anything. I had not asked for rescue. I had merely allowed, for a brief, brave moment, the possibility that my life could be different. When I walked back out into the light, the city seemed sharper. Cars moved in deliberate patterns, People hurried with the small velocities of their own lives. My heart had a peculiar tentative looseness to it, as if it had been clenched for so long that opening felt strange. There are decisions that feel like walking toward a cliff and discovering a path. Meeting Julian had been a step on that path. It was an offering of choice, and choices terrify you when you've been trained to live within boundaries. I knew the stakes. I knew the sharpness of Fletcher's temper when he felt slighted. I knew the practicalities of what his withdrawal of comfort could do. But I also knew the way the emerald warmed in my hand, and the way the card had felt like an invitation. That night I sat with the card and the envelope of possible employment, and tried to imagine a life where I could sign my name on a dotted line that belonged to no one but me. I thought of the small freedoms, an account in my own name, a phone that was mine, the right to open a bank statement without asking permission. In the dark, I rehearsed how I might speak to Fletcher. I practiced the language of assertiveness, the things I had swallowed for years. I was not naive. I knew there would be cost. I knew there would be hard reckonings. But there are moments when the memory of what you once were gleams so brightly that you cannot bear to be small any longer. I thought of the gala, of that moment when he announced me as the help, and how small words could be weapons used to carve a life into sections. The card had come like a counterweapon, an object that held the possibility of reclaiming a sentence or two in my story. When I finally moved, it was with the kind of clarity that comes after crying until your face is dry. I put the emerald ring into a small velvet pouch, not to hide it, not yet to discard it, but to remind myself of the weight of choices. I slid the business card into my wallet next to a photograph I had carried for years, a snapshot of me and Julian on a summer's day, young and defiant, our faces lit with the stupid kind of certainty that the world will be kind. I dialed the number on the card. My hands were steady. I told myself I was doing nothing dramatic, nothing foolish. I was taking the one thing Fletcher could not give me, an appointment with my own life. The voice that answered was warm and familiar before I recognized it. "Hello," it said, and there was no rush. "This is Rebecca. Julian told me you might call." Rebecca's voice was practical and efficient, the kind of voice that arranges things in the world and makes them usable. We set a time for an interview. She asked me a few basics: education, availability, what compelled me to apply. She did not ask about my marriage, and I appreciated that. She seemed to understand the kinds of lives people carry and the small, quiet ways those lives shift. When I hung up, the room felt both larger and more frightening. I had set something in motion. A choice had been articulated into action. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small administrative move that could alter the contours of my life. That night, I lay awake thinking about how many small acts add up to a life. How having a job, an account, an address that is yours, these are not merely items on a list, they are the architecture of autonomy. I thought about how I had been introduced at the gala as the help, and how a single word could make years of work and love evaporate into insignificance. I also thought about Julian's face when he saw me, the honest recognition, and how that look had unmoored something in me that had been steady for years. It is one thing to miss someone. It is another to be seen by them in a world that has decided how you should be. To be seen is a radical gesture. I had not yet told Fletcher anything. I had not decided when or how. The job was not yet mine. The card, the interview, the envelope of possibility. They were the first few stones in a road that might lead somewhere, or might lead me back to the life I had already learned to wear. But I had decided not to let another day pass, pretending that my silence was a virtue. I had made a small, necessary defiance. I had reached for the possibility of being more than the place I had been put in. The next morning, I found a bruise blooming under the skin of my forearm, old enough to be explainable but stubborn, like a truth that would not be hidden. It stung less than it used to, perhaps because something else burned brighter now, a stubborn, ridiculous hope. I rubbed the spot with my thumb and thought of how many small acts of bravery it takes to become someone else. I was on the train before dawn, the city still rubbing sleep from its eyes. The envelope with the employment papers burned a little in my bag. I thought of the things I had filed under "not possible." I thought of the emerald in its velvet, as bright as a secret. At the Blue Moon Cafe, I would be measured, ask questions, evaluated. I might be found wanting. I might be given the hand I had once been denied. In either case, the act of going was already a kind of emancipation. I had not yet decided when I would say my name again in full, without apology, but I felt the muscles of that word flexing in my jaw. I felt, in the small arch of my collarbone, the preparedness to stand, finally, in the light. The interview was quieter than I expected. Rebecca led me down a corridor whose walls held photography of buildings and meetings I'd never thought I'd belong to. Her shoes made a soft rhythm that matched the thudding in my chest. She introduced me simply, not with the kind of ceremony Fletcher insisted on, but with a clarity that made me feel as if someone had finally decided how to place the furniture in a room I hadn't even known I owned. We sat in a small office with plants that looked patient. Rebecca asked me about my experience managing homes, but framed the questions like they were professional skills, logistics, scheduling, discretion. She listened with that rare kind of attention that keeps you from explaining more than you need to. When I told her about bookkeeping for a household, she smiled and said, "Those skills translate." It was a sentence that felt like a key turning. "Why do you want this?" she asked, looking at me directly. "I want to be able to sign my name and have it mean something," I said. It surprised me how honest it sounded. She was quiet for a beat and then asked about my availability, my references, whether I felt comfortable working in an environment with travelling executives and late nights. She didn't flinch at the bruise on my forearm. She slid a small form across the desk and said, "Mark it confidentially. We'll do the rest." When I left, the city had that late September light, sharp enough to make outlines honest. I had the sense of a life reassembled in small acts. For a week I walked on that seam between fear and possibility. When the call came offering me the position, part-time, administrative, with a salary that would allow me an account in my own name, I accepted with a hand that didn't tremble. I told Fletcher there was a new position at the company where I could do some consulting. He nodded and said, "That's just the type of growth I've always wanted for you." I smiled and kept the ledger of my new salary in the bottom drawer of the desk. I signed papers at the bank myself, an artless, unforgettable bureaucratic theft against the life he'd thought he could bind me to. My name on those statements felt like first light. Work became the place where I relearned how to be more than an accessory. I organised files that had once been other people's problems. I sat in meetings and learned the language of projections and deliverables. Rebecca showed me how to carve a space in a world that feared to make room. She was practical and sharply protective. She taught me how to accept an email without the embarrassment Fletcher had trained into me. She treated me like a colleague from the first day, and I discovered that being treated like an equal made me braver than any speech I could have rehearsed. Julian came into my orbit gently. He was neither theatrical nor rushed. When he saw me in the office for the first time, he paused, and there was that old recognition. Only now it was steadier, tempered by the years between us. He didn't make grand declarations. He provided a desk and a title, and he expected me to fill them. The work was real. The salary gave me autonomy, and autonomy had its own propulsion. Fletcher noticed the change the way someone notices a new stain on expensive fabric. He calculated, cajoled, and, when calculation didn't work, threatened. He had the instinct of a man who believed leverage was the truest form of love. At first his threats were small and administrative, requests for receipts, sudden questions about the accounts I was allowed to see. When those couldn't pin me down, he aimed his cruelty at the social places I inhabited. He made callous comments at parties, tried to embarrass me in front of friends, and used the modest fury of people who feel their control slipping to make me feel foolish for asserting myself. There was one evening, months after the job began, that crystallized what I had walked into and what I was walking out of. Fletcher had scheduled a dinner for a group of his colleagues and invited me because he believed I would be an excellent ornament. He called me in the study before we left, and with that practiced condescension he reserved for private lectures, he said, "Remember your place. Do not bring shame on me." "I won't," I said. I kept my answer soft. I'd learned that rushing to correct him only made him tighten the leash. At the dinner, he began in the manner he knew best, trimming my autonomy with a small joke about household administration. One of his friends looked at me with a curiosity that wasn't meant to be kind. I could feel the old reflex: fold back, be pretty, make sure the room doesn't notice the seam. But this time a small, stubborn heat rose in my chest. I excused myself and walked into the kitchen where the light was plain and unadorned. He followed, and in a way that was almost mechanical, he reached for me. I pulled away. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Keeping you from being an embarrassment," he said. The words were as precise as they had always been. "You are my wife. It's for both our good. You're mistaken if you think being small is keeping me safe," I said. It came out harsher than intended, but I meant it. His eyes flashed with that coldness that had always scared me. Not violence, not yet, but the sharpening of intent. He put a hand on the table as if to steady himself, and then, with a kind of fatalistic bravado, said, "You should be grateful. You have comfort." "Comfort?" I laughed, the sound too sharp for the narrow room. "You call this comfort?" My laughter reverberated oddly against the tile. I thought of the bank statements and the keys I'd signed for, of ledgers and limits. I thought of the new account that had my name on it, and the way that account felt like a promise I was only beginning to accept. That night, when I returned to the apartment after an argument that dissolved into long silences, I found a note on the kitchen counter. It was curt and contained exactly 5 sentences. He knew about the job. He would allow me the salary for pretence's sake. I was not to undermine him. He warned me that rumours could be dangerous, and he reminded me that he built our life. In the margin he had written, in a hand that wanted to look casual but read as threat, "Remember what I can make disappear." What he meant wasn't hidden. He had always been good with disappearances, of reputations, of bank balances, of the careful social scaffolding that supports a life like his. He had always believed that fear was the most efficient kind of control. Instead of cowering, I placed the note in a drawer next to my own bank card and an invoice from a supplier I had negotiated myself. There was no theatrical defiance in it, no dramatic letter left on a table to signify the start of war, just a quiet reorganization of priorities. I called Rebecca the next morning and told her what had happened. She listened, and then, in her efficient way, she said, "We will document everything. Keep those notes." She arranged for a lawyer friend to call, a person who dealt privately with matters that required discretion. It felt unexpectedly like arming oneself with useful things, a list of names, a contact, someone who would not judge. Fletcher heard the noises of my rearrangement and tried new tactics. He began to threaten legal avenues, hints about suits, insinuations about reputation, the threat of blocking access to money. Once, furious that I had accepted an invitation to a colleagues-only event, he cornered me in the bedroom, and in a voice that had been trained to sound reasonable said, "I will make sure whatever little careers you pick up don't last. I can make sure doors shut." "Your threats are hollow," I said. It was a lie I needed to believe. That lie broke the night he admitted something I had suspected like a shadow for years. He had known about Julian's search. He revealed, with the smugness of a man airing a secret he imagined would terrify, that he had systematically sabotaged people who had come close to finding me. He'd bribed investigators, misdirected inquiries, and buried leads in the kinds of administrative dust Fletcher despised. He said it with the proud tone of a man who believed cunning was synonymous with fidelity. "You think you can take that man back after what he left you for?" he said, to wound and to own. "I made sure he would never find you." I felt as if someone had switched the floor beneath my feet. The world reoriented itself around his words. The confession was a piece of ugly intimacy, him telling me how thoroughly he'd erased the choices I'd once had. He told me the lengths he'd gone to preserve the life he'd built, and that he regarded his interference as an act of preservation. I remember standing very still. "Why would you tell me this?" I asked. "Because you need to be grateful," he said simply. Gratitude is a tricky instrument in a house built on exchanges. I had been made grateful for allowances for years. His confession was meant to be another coin pressed into my palm. But it changed the dynamic in a way he had not intended. When someone reveals the extent of their control, they also reveal their fear of losing it. In showing me his hand, he showed me the seams. After that, the threats became bolder. He filed paperwork that suggested I was incompetent with money and that he was concerned for my well-being. He hinted at the idea of separation in ways that were designed to unsettle rather than to actually separate. He was a man with the resources to make life administratively untenable. It was the way of a bully who can afford the law as a cudgel. When he finally struck, it was not the theatrical carting off I had imagined. He didn't do anything dramatic in public. Instead, he used the legal tools that look like normal life. He froze joint accounts by claiming a discrepancy. He filed for a temporary order to access documents, and he threatened to claim that my involvement with Julian disrupted the sanctity of our marriage. The last threat was a faint echo of an old law, alienation of affection, that he intended to wield as intimidation. It was crass and archaic, and it made me furious in a very clear way. Men like him believed they could litigate away a woman's appetite for autonomy. I had made contingency plans with Rebecca and with the lawyer she had introduced. We moved quickly. Julian provided a lawyer of his own to assist with the legal manoeuvring. Rebecca's eyes met mine one morning in the office, and with a glance told me we were not alone. She brought me a thermos of coffee when the nights were long, and paperwork seemed to multiply like a rash. The legal skirmish was ugly in a way that lawyers prefer. Dry, document-heavy, and designed to make you feel as if your life can be reduced to exhibits. Fletcher's lawyers suggested that my new employment was a sign of vindictiveness. Ours suggested it was career building. The judge signed temporary orders that allowed me access to my new bank account pending resolution. It was not vindictive justice, it was a legal breathing space. What broke the cycle, however, was not only paperwork. It was the discovery of something Fletcher had hidden in the tidy crevices of his life. Rebecca's contacts ran a quieter net than I could have imagined. Julian's team had resources, and they used them with an economy I began to trust. Through a series of document requests and a quiet piece of forensic accounting, they found irregular transfers, channels of money that justified the attention of people who deal with larger crimes. It was enough for the investigators to sniff out patterns that suggested something beyond petty theft or eccentric generosity. It suggested an organised method of moving funds through shell companies and offshore accounts. I learned about the discovery like a person reads a letter through someone else's shoulder. Julian called me into his office one morning. He closed the door, and there was the soft gravity to his face I had come to rely upon. "They found something," he said. "It's not small." He explained with restraint what his lawyers had started to uncover, transactions that flowed through accounts Fletcher had access to, vendors who existed only on paper, invoices that matched no deliveries. "It doesn't prove anything yet," he said, "but it's enough for them to look further." There was a peculiar vindication in watching the machine of investigation whir to life. Not because I wanted to see Fletcher humiliated, but because the tools he used to control our life were now turned outward in a way that validated my sense that the comfortable life he'd offered was less a sanctuary than a fraud. Fletcher, for his part, did not handle the scrutiny well. Where he had usually been a man of composed menace, he became quick and careless. He lashed out, threatened those he saw as enemies, and at one point, when the pressure tightened, he did something that finally unclenched something in me. He struck, not in a blow planned to end a life, but in a gesture meant to frighten and to show ownership. The bruise this time was broader on my upper arm. It was immediate and ugly, and it made me understand, with a terrible clarity, that his threats had a physical component I had not wanted to admit was possible. I left the house with an overnight bag and the list of documents Rebecca had told me to bring: passport, marriage certificate, copies of bank statements, and, perhaps most importantly, a photograph of myself with Julian that we had never published. I drove to a small flat Julian had kept for work, practical, unfussy, a place with a kettle and clean mugs, and when I sat on the narrow couch and watched him make tea, I realised how different the world could feel when someone did not try to micromanage your feelings. "You should have called me sooner," he said quietly. "I know," I said. "I wanted to be sure. I wanted to be the one who left." He put the cup down and took my hands. "You left," he said. "You didn't wait for me to rescue you." It was one of the most important sentences anyone had ever said to me. It placed my agency where it belonged, with me. It reminded me that the story people like to tell, about the noble rescue, is almost always a distortion. I had arranged for my own exit. Julian's team provided the practical cushion, but the decision was mine. He helped me find a small lawyer, someone who spoke in precise, calm sentences, and together we made a plan. It was not theatrical. We filed the necessary paperwork to protect my new accounts, documented the abuse, recorded the threats. We did not, in that moment, file for divorce. I was careful. I wanted the exposure to do its work, and sometimes exposure takes its own time. The police came one afternoon to Fletcher's office with a warrant based on the evidence Julian's team had supplied to authorities. It was not cinematic. There were no dramatic handcuffs in the foyer, no cameras. There were officers who carried folded paper and a quiet, efficient sense of duty. They took statements, photographed ledgers, and escorted Fletcher out as if he were a puzzled guest at his own unmade party. He was arrested on suspicion of money laundering, an allegation that sounded almost absurdly clinical compared to the intimacy of what he had done to me. There were no headlines about the marriage in those first days. The papers reported a quiet corporate probe. For a while, the legal apparatus moved in parallel. My personal claims of control and fear, and the state's investigation into financial crimes. When the police took Fletcher away, I felt a complex set of things that were not reducible to joy. There was relief, yes, and a curious, chastened sorrow over how many years had been spent in the service of a lie. I also felt a fierce, vindictive satisfaction, less at his humiliation than at the public unmasking of a system that had allowed moments like the one at the gala to be taken as a certificate of ownership. He called me from a holding cell once, his voice small and edged. "You will regret this," he said. "No," I replied. "I won't." We did not seek vengeance. We sought the practical restoration of my life. The indictment, when it came, was a bureaucratic confirmation of what Julian's team had suspected. It was not poetic. It was a stack of documents and a date on a calendar. I was not a star witness in a spectacle. I testified calmly about patterns of control and the specifics of his threats. It was not easy to speak of the bruises, but I spoke of them with the bluntness of facts. Where they had been, how they had been covered, how they had folded into the choreography of our lives. I said the words I had rehearsed in a small room with a lawyer who did not judge me for being ashamed of what had been allowed to happen. The legal unravelling liberated me in ways that were both practical and symbolic. With Fletcher's accounts frozen pending investigation, I had time to arrange my finances in ways that did not require his permission. Julian's company formalised my position and, importantly, left me space to learn a new professional identity without rumour or patronising pity. Rebecca remained my anchor at work, providing counsel when the office felt like a strange place to be seen. Through the months after the arrest, I rebuilt a life that felt like stitching a quilt. Some squares were bright, laughter with new friends, afternoons at the office where people asked my opinion on things that mattered. Some were dull. Court dates, the slow, bureaucratic churn that accompanies investigations. I began to travel a little for work, and the city opened up in ways I had always suspected it could. I took small trips to museums, to parks where people walked their dogs, to restaurants where the staff asked my name and I said it back with no preface. Julian and I moved forward carefully. We did not convert the story into a parable of rescue. He apologised for the way things had happened. He never apologised for the past decisions of his family, but he apologised for the part the past had played in the pain I had endured. He never used his position as leverage. If there was courtship in our friendship, it was measured. We spent months learning where boundaries fit and how we might build something together, without erasing the self that had been burned away and slowly regrown. There were awkward moments of tenderness, long walks where we didn't speak, a dinner where he introduced me to his sister awkwardly, and a conversation with his ex-wife, Catherine, who stopped by our office one afternoon with a small, tentative kindness. Catherine had been a figure in Julian's past, and the way she spoke to me was neither territorial nor conspiratorial. She asked me about the work I was doing, and with a matter-of-factness I admired, she said, "You deserve to be in rooms that treasure what you bring." My hands had a new steadiness to them. I worked on a small project to streamline a line of charitable giving that had long been inefficient, and the board liked my reports. The first time I spoke at a company event, my voice quivered at the edges, and then steadied. People applauded for the precision of a plan, not for the costume I had worn at parties. When we finally married, it was months later in a small, quiet ceremony that felt like choosing neighbours rather than an audience. Margaret, ever practical and warm, helped with the flowers. David stood as David always had, a friend who laughed loudly and loved stubbornly. Rebecca arranged the small reception. Julian's father did not attend. Charles remained an absence in the way some people are absent, felt, but not present. We exchanged vows that were short and true. I didn't need a speech to place the past where it belonged. The vows were enough. I kept the emerald in its velvet pouch for the ceremony. When Julian took my hand, he did not demand it back. He gave me a simple band that fit my fingers like a promise without possession. Later, in private, we made a small ritual of the heirloom. I did not relinquish it out of defiance or tenderness. Instead, I slipped it back onto my finger because some things are maps of who you were and reminders of what you survived. The ring became mine in the way that a healed scar belongs to you, part of your flesh, not an ornament for someone else's admiration. The day of the wedding was warm. The room smelled faintly of lemon, and the light had that forgiving softness that makes everything look kinder. There were moments that felt like small miracles. The way Margaret fussed over a stray strand of hair, the ridiculous, enormous grin David made while giving a toast that was more about friendship than ceremony. Our friends were there, people who had watched me reshuffle a life and had chosen to stay. We did not make a spectacle of Fletcher's arrest. He was a figure in a far too practical series of legal events. The case continued to wend its way through the system in the background like an administrative treadmill. The people who mattered in that room were not the ones tied to his downfall. They were the ones who stayed, who offered salads, quilts, advice, and the occasional bracing honesty. We cut cake, we danced in a small circle, and for a small stretch of time allowed ourselves the absurdity of being called Mr. and Mrs. in the way that made strangers smile. Marriage to Julian was not the end of a story. It was the careful beginning of a life in which I had been permitted to author myself again. He did not pretend to be perfect. He had his own wounds from the years he had been taught to please his father and to manage expectations with a ledger. We learned how to argue without resorting to the tools of control we'd both seen so much. We learned to keep our finances transparent to one another, not as a way to control, but as a way to build trust. One afternoon, months after the wedding, we sat on a bench in a park and watched children play. I took the emerald from its pouch and turned it, letting the light find its green. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked him. "Choosing me back then? Choosing me now?" He looked at me for a long time, as if cataloguing the exact shape of my face. "I regret the parts I didn't protect you from," he said. "But I don't regret finding you again." There is a tenderness to that sentence I have held onto. It is not an absolution for what I gave up, or for the years that passed, but it is a commitment to tending what remains. We live with the knowledge that the past shapes the present, but the past doesn't have to dictate the future. I kept working at Blackwood Industries. I built programs, mentored a new assistant named Claire, and found a rhythm that satisfied my appetite for autonomy. I taught myself small things: how to balance spreadsheets that used to look like hieroglyphs, how to present to a board without shrinking, how to say no cleanly. My life became the kind of ordinary craft work I had once dreamed of. Imperfect, engaged, and insistently mine. Sometimes, when I am asked about the moment at the gala, the line that made a room go quiet when Fletcher called me the help, I tell the truth. I say that words can be knives and also mirrors. They can shape how others see you and how you see yourself. The humiliation was real, but it did not define the rest of my life. What defined my life was a sequence of small decisions: going to a cafe, accepting a job, opening an account, calling a lawyer, taking an overnight bag and not returning. If I have learned anything from the decades of me that predated the moment Julian reached for my hand, it is that agency is not a sudden flame, but a slow accumulation of embers. You build a life by tending the small things until they become a fire. People sometimes ask me if I forgive Fletcher. I think forgiveness is a private verb. I do not gloss over what happened. I also do not expend myself on a person who no longer holds my hand at night. There is a kind of compassion in letting go, less theatrical than revenge, more sustainable. When I look at the emerald now, I see a timeline of resilience. It is not a symbol of ownership anymore. It is an archive of choices. The business card that started it all is in a drawer somewhere. Every once in a while I take it out, not to smell the ink or to wish for past versions of myself, but to remember the precise moment my life pivoted. Small objects have that power, to hold memory like a weight and to remind you how far you have come. If there is a quiet lesson in all of this, it is that dignity is not something you are given. It is something you retrieve. It is folded into daily acts, signing a bank document, saying no to humiliation, taking a job that makes your name mean something. It is also found in the people who show up and do not try to own your pain. There is no mythic rescue. There are partnerships, processes, and the rare human kindness of someone who will hold your hand without claiming ownership of your life. I tell my story not for spectacle, but for company. If you have ever been introduced to something smaller than you are, if you've been told to stay in the back to keep someone else's shine pure, know that small acts can add up. A business card, a coffee, an honest talk with someone who sees you. These are not trivial. They are how lives are rebuilt. If this resonates with you, tell me where you're watching from. Share if you know the weight of choosing safety over truth and how it felt to reclaim your voice. Subscribe if you want more stories of ordinary courage and second chances. I read every comment, and the cities you write in make the map of a life that stretches farther than any of us can see from one lonely ballroom.